The judge's voice cracked like a rifle shot across that courtroom. Take it off. 3 words, and 40 years of service meant nothing to him. I stood there in my dress uniform, my Navy Cross catching the fluorescent light, and felt every eye in that room land on my chest like a verdict already decided. My sister-in-law was smiling. She thought she'd already won. She had no idea what was sitting inside my briefcase, and neither did the man in the black robe, who was about to collapse at his own bench before this hearing was over. My name is Eleanor Brooks, and I've spent 18 years wearing this uniform. I've bled for it. I've buried friends who wore the same one. And on a gray Tuesday morning, in a county courthouse that smelled like burnt coffee and old carpet, I found myself standing trial, not for anything I'd done wrong, but because a woman I once called family decided my honor was something she could put a price tag on. I want to tell you how I got there, because it didn't happen overnight. Nothing like this ever does. I joined the army at 22, straight out of college, back when my father used to joke I had more stubbornness than sense. He wasn't wrong. I served most of 2 decades overseas, chasing missions I still can't talk about at dinner parties. I was wounded once, badly enough that I spent 4 months relearning how to walk without wincing. And somewhere in the middle of all that, during a joint operation with a Marine unit I still think about at 3 in the morning sometimes, I earned something called the Navy Cross. It's not a medal you talk about. It's one you carry quietly, because the people who understand what it costs don't need you to explain it, and the people who don't understand never will. I never wore it to family dinners. I never brought it up at church picnics or mentioned it when neighbors asked what I did for a living. I said, I'm in the army, and left it at that. My mother used to tell people her daughter was a hero, and I'd change the subject so fast you'd think she'd insulted me. That's just who I am. Quiet. Steady. I don't need applause to know what I did was real. My sister-in-law Melissa was cut from different cloth entirely. She married my brother Daniel about 12 years ago, and from the very first Thanksgiving, I could feel her sizing up our family like a woman doing inventory, the china cabinet, my mother's wedding ring, the deed to the old house, like she was calculating their resale value in her head. Daniel loved her, and I tried, God knows I tried, to see what he saw. But love doesn't erase the way somebody treats a waitress, or the way they talk about people behind their backs the second they leave the room. When my parents passed, my father first, from a heart that had given out slowly over years, my mother 18 months later from a grief I don't think she ever intended to survive, they left the family house to Daniel and me equally. A modest place, nothing extravagant. White clapboard, a wraparound porch, an oak tree in the backyard my father had planted the year I was born. It wasn't about the money. It was the last piece of them we had left. Melissa didn't see it that way. She saw square footage. She saw a listing price. She started pushing Daniel almost immediately. Sell the house, split the cash. Let's use it for the kids' college fund. Let's use it to expand the business. Let's use it for anything except letting it sit there gathering dust and memories. Daniel, to his credit, resisted for a while, but Melissa has a way of wearing people down. She doesn't yell. She just repeats herself, softer and softer, until you agree just to make the noise stop. I refused to sell. I told Daniel I wanted to keep it in the family, maybe fix it up, maybe let his kids spend summers there the way we used to. He seemed to understand. Melissa did not. Months went by. Phone calls got shorter. Holidays got tense. And then one afternoon in early spring, I got served with legal papers at my own front door, delivered by a man in a windbreaker who wouldn't quite meet my eyes. Melissa was suing me. The claim on paper was about misappropriation of shared property. Fancy words for something much simpler, she wanted to force a sale, and when I wouldn't budge, she decided the courtroom was where she'd get her way. I remember standing on my porch that day, papers in hand, feeling something I hadn't felt since my last deployment. Not fear exactly, more like the cold, clarifying calm that comes right before you have to do something difficult. Daniel called me that night, apologetic, torn, caught in the middle of a war he never wanted. I told him I understood. I wasn't angry at him. But I also wasn't going to fold just because someone decided my patience was a weakness to exploit. Weeks later, I walked into that courtroom in my dress uniform, not for show, not for sympathy, but because I'd just come from a veterans memorial service that morning and hadn't had time to change. My Navy Cross was pinned exactly where regulation said it should be. I sat down at the defendant's table, straightened my jacket, and glanced once at Melissa, who was already whispering something to her lawyer with a smile stretched a little too wide across her face. The judge, a heavy-set man named Richard Harmon, with a reputation for running his courtroom like a personal kingdom, banged his gavel to bring the room to order. He looked over the paperwork, glanced up at me once, and something in his expression shifted, something sharp, something almost offended. Then he leaned forward, tapped his pen against the bench, and said the words that would end up changing everything. "This is not a place to show off war trophies." I'd heard about Judge Harmon before I ever set foot in his courtroom. Lawyers talked about him the way you'd talk about weather you couldn't control. He had a reputation for arrogance dressed up as authority, for cutting people off mid-sentence, and apparently, somewhere along the way, a particular disdain for what he called military theater, people who used their service like a costume to win sympathy points. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," I said, keeping my voice level. "This uniform isn't a costume. I came from a memorial service this morning." He didn't even look up from his paperwork. "Take off the medal." The room went quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone suddenly realizes they're watching something they shouldn't be. My attorney, a sharp young man named Foster, started to rise, his mouth already forming an objection. I put my hand gently on his arm and shook my head. "Is that an official order of this court?" I asked. Harmon's eyes flicked up to mine. "Yes. It is." Beside me, I heard Melissa exhale a soft, satisfied breath. I sat there for a moment, feeling the weight of every eye in that gallery. Somewhere behind me, I heard a low murmur ripple through the rows of spectators. Court days like this one usually drew a strange mix of people, retirees who came just to watch, law students doing research, a few regulars who treated the courthouse like a soap opera they couldn't miss an episode of. And scattered among them I noticed a couple of older men sitting stiff-backed in the third row, the kind of posture you only get from years of formation drills. One of them, a silver-haired man in a faded ball cap, was staring at my chest with an expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to disbelief. He recognized it. I could see it happen in real time, the moment his eyes landed on the medal and something clicked into place. His jaw tightened. He leaned over and murmured something to the man beside him, who then also turned to look at me, this time with wide eyes. Neither of them said a word out loud. Nobody ever does in a courtroom. You learn early that the silence is its own kind of law, heavier than anything written down in a statute book. But I could feel that old veteran's discomfort radiating off him like heat from a stove. He knew exactly what that medal meant, and he knew exactly how wrong this moment was, and he sat there in his folding chair, unable to do a single thing about it. I thought about my father in that moment, oddly enough. He used to tell me that the loudest rooms were rarely where the real decisions got made. The real decisions happened in the quiet ones, in the pauses between words, in the choices people made when they thought no one important was watching. I'd carried that with me through every deployment, every debrief, every long silence in a command tent, waiting for orders that might never come. This felt like one of those quiet rooms, and I intended to make my decision count. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady, almost gentle. "Before I comply, I'd like the record to reflect the nature of this request. Ms. Brooks, this isn't a debate." "Major Brooks," I corrected quietly. Not sharply, just a fact laid on the table like a card. "And I understand it isn't a debate. I only want the transcript to be accurate." For a moment, something flickered across his face, irritation, yes, but underneath it, something else. A flicker of uncertainty, like a man realizing the floor beneath him wasn't quite as solid as he'd assumed. Something flickered across his face, irritation, but underneath it, a flicker of uncertainty. He recovered quickly. "Proceed with whatever you need to proceed with," he said. "But the medal comes off before we continue." I reached down, unclasped my briefcase, and set it on the table with a quiet, deliberate click. Melissa's smile faltered slightly. Inside, tucked in a blue folder I'd prepared weeks earlier, was everything I needed. "Permission to approach, Your Honor," I said, and when he nodded impatiently, I walked the folder up to the bench myself. I wanted him to have to open it. The first page was a formal citation confirming the award of the Navy Cross. The second was a Department of Defense verification record, the kind of document that exists specifically to settle disputes about military honors. The third was a formal legal opinion from the Office of the General Counsel, addressing the protections and protocols surrounding the wearing of duly awarded military decorations during official proceedings. Not a suggestion. Policy, backed by federal guidance. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "Your Honor, I'd ask that you read the final page." He turned it. I watched his jaw work, the muscle beneath his cheek tightening and releasing. I watched the flush climb up from his collar, that particular shade of red that isn't embarrassment exactly. It's closer to the color of a man realizing he might have just made a mistake in front of witnesses, in front of a court reporter, in front of a room full of people who would remember exactly what he said and how he said it. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice carried something closer to concern. "I've had legal counsel for some time, Your Honor," I said simply. I anticipated this might become more complicated than a property dispute. The final page was a memorandum laying out, in plain and unambiguous language, the expectation that judicial officials handle properly worn military uniforms and decorations with appropriate respect during court proceedings, and that any request to remove them be grounded in clear legal necessity rather than personal discretion. No ambiguity. No room for a judge to claim he simply hadn't known better. My attorney cleared his throat. "Your Honor, given the sensitivity of this matter, I'd like to formally request that the court's remarks from this morning be preserved verbatim in the official transcript." "That's already standard procedure, Counselor. Just wanted it on the record." Harmon set the folder down slowly. "Let's move forward," he said, his voice quieter than it had been all morning. "We'll revisit procedural matters later." It wasn't an apology. I hadn't expected one. But I'd been in enough command rooms to recognize retreat when I saw it. "Your Honor," I said, "I have one more witness to call." The courtroom doors opened with a heavy, deliberate sound. Colonel Michael Sanders had been my commanding officer during the deployment that earned me the Navy Cross. Retired now, silver-haired, still carrying the posture that made civilians instinctively straighten up when he walked past. He walked down the center aisle in a suit instead of a uniform, but it didn't matter, everyone in that courtroom could tell this was a man who'd spent his life giving orders and having them followed without question. Foster walked him through his credentials: 31 years of service, 2 combat deployments as a young officer, years commanding units overseas, including the joint operation where he'd served as my direct commanding officer. "Colonel Sanders, can you confirm Major Brooks's account of the events that led to her receiving the Navy Cross?" "I can. I was there." I submitted the recommendation myself. He described it plainly, without embellishment, the operation, the moment things went wrong, a decision I'd made under fire that had saved lives that weren't supposed to make it out of that situation. I sat very still while he spoke. I always do when someone else tells that story. Then Sanders said something that hadn't been in our rehearsed questions. "I should also mention," he said, turning slightly toward the bench, "that I spent the last several years of my career training judicial and legal personnel in military protocol, including proper courtroom conduct regarding uniforms and decorations. It's part of a continuing education program many jurisdictions require." The room went very quiet. Sanders looked directly at Harmon. "You should have known this." It's not obscure information. It's basic training material. Harmon's face went through several colors in the span of about 4 seconds. Melissa's attorney rose abruptly. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess. Denied, Harmon said, a little too quickly, a little too sharply. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. Foster looked at me, a question in his eyes. I gave him a small nod. Your Honor, before we continue, there's something I need the court to be aware of. The screen flickered to life on the courtroom display. A confirmation notice, time-stamped and official, showing that a formal complaint had been submitted just minutes before proceedings began that morning, not out of malice, not as some trap I'd set for the judge to walk into blindly, but filed to protect the integrity of the process, the same way every serious military operation I'd ever been part of required oversight, documentation, accountability. The recipients sat there in plain black text. The Judicial Oversight Committee. The state's Judicial Ethics Investigator. The Regional Veterans Affairs Liaison Office, given the nature of the potential violation. Everything said here today, I explained, keeping my voice level, has already been recorded through the court's own system, as confirmed by the clerk. That recording, along with today's transcript, will be part of the review process. Harmon didn't say anything right away. He sat there staring at the screen, and I watched something settle over his face, not fear exactly, more like the sudden sinking understanding that the outcome of the next several months was no longer entirely in his hands. I'd seen that look before, in soldiers who'd just realized the terrain they were standing on wasn't the terrain they thought it was. It's a particular kind of stillness, the moment someone understands that an independent review process, once triggered, doesn't simply go away because the person under review apologizes or backpedals. It runs its course. Then his hand went to his chest. It happened fast enough that for a moment nobody in the gallery quite registered what they were seeing. He gripped the edge of the bench, his face draining from red to a pale, waxy gray in a matter of seconds. His gavel slipped from his fingers and clattered against the wood. He started, and the word came out wrong, breathless, cut short. Your Honor, the bailiff said, already moving toward him. Harmon's shoulders slumped forward. He caught himself against the bench for a moment, then didn't. He went down heavily in his chair, sliding sideways, one arm knocking a stack of papers to the floor. The courtroom erupted. Melissa's lawyer was on his feet, the old veteran in the third row was already up and moving toward the aisle, someone was shouting for a medic, and for a few seconds the entire room dissolved into the kind of chaos that happens when people who've spent their whole lives following procedure suddenly find themselves in a situation with no procedure to follow. I was on my feet too, before I'd even decided to be. 18 years of training doesn't turn off just because you're standing in a courtroom instead of a forward operating base. Call an ambulance, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, steady in a way that made 2 or 3 people actually stop and listen. Someone get the bailiff to clear the aisle. Now. I moved around the defendant's table and knelt beside him, checking his pulse at his wrist, my fingers finding the rhythm, fast, thready, but there. His breathing was shallow, his lips tinged faintly blue. Sir, can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. A weak pressure against my fingers. Good. Conscious, at least partially. I loosened his collar, tilted him slightly to keep his airway clear, and kept talking to him in the same low, even voice I'd used on soldiers bleeding out in places far worse than this. You're going to be okay. Help is coming. Stay with me. Look at me, not the ceiling. Stay with me. Foster had already gotten the clerk to call 911, and I could hear her voice behind me, clipped and clear, giving the dispatcher the address, the situation, the man's approximate age. Melissa hadn't moved from her seat. When I glanced back at her for half a second, her face had gone the same pale color as the judge's, not from concern for him, I think, but from the sudden, dawning realization that whatever she'd walked in expecting that morning had completely dissolved into something she no longer had any control over. The paramedics arrived within 11 minutes, an eternity in a room that had gone from courtroom decorum to barely controlled chaos. I stepped back the moment they took over, giving them the same clipped, useful information I'd have given any incoming medevac crew. Chest pain, onset maybe 90 seconds ago, pulse rapid and thready, brief loss of consciousness, no response to voice for about 10 seconds before regaining partial awareness. The lead paramedic looked up at me for half a second, registering the uniform, the medal, then nodded and kept working. They had him on a stretcher and out through the side doors within minutes, an oxygen mask over his face, his eyes fluttering but open. The courtroom sat in a stunned, ringing silence after the doors swung shut behind them. Melissa hadn't moved from her seat. Her earlier composure was gone entirely, replaced by something pale and shaken. I sat back down slowly, feeling the adrenaline drain out of my shoulders the way it always does after, too fast, then all at once, leaving you strangely hollow. Foster leaned over. You just gave a heart attack victim medical care in the middle of his own courtroom. I gave a person medical care, I said. The rest is just where it happened to happen. The bailiff announced the proceedings were suspended indefinitely, pending the court's health and further scheduling. Nobody argued. Nobody moved very fast to leave either, as though the room itself needed a minute to remember how to breathe normally again. Judge Harmon survived. A cardiac event, not catastrophic, but serious enough that his doctors ordered an extended medical leave the moment he was stable. What came out in the weeks that followed, though, had nothing to do with his heart and everything to do with the file that had already been set in motion before he ever collapsed. The Judicial Oversight Committee didn't pause its review just because the subject of the complaint was recovering in a hospital bed. If anything, the incident drew more attention to the case, not less, a sitting judge collapsing mid-hearing after a documented, recorded exchange about a decorated veteran's military honors was not the kind of story that stayed contained to one county courthouse. Reporters started calling. Not many, and not for long, but enough that Foster warned me to expect a few calls of my own. I declined every interview request. This was never about being seen. It was about making sure the record reflected what had actually happened, and it already did, time-stamped and permanent, whether anyone outside that room ever heard about it or not. I visited the hospital once, about a week after it happened, not because I felt any obligation exactly, but because 18 years in the Army teaches you that the line between an enemy and a person who made a bad decision is thinner than most people want to admit. Harmon was sitting up in bed, tubes gone, color returned, looking smaller somehow than he had behind that bench. He didn't say much. He thanked me, quietly, almost reluctantly, for what I'd done in the courtroom. I told him I would have done the same for anyone. I meant it. 3 months passed before the committee released its findings. In that time, life did what life always does. It kept moving whether you were ready for it or not. I went back to work. I attended a funeral for a fellow veteran I'd served with years earlier, stood at attention in a cemetery under a gray sky, and thought more than once about how strange it was that honor sometimes gets tested in places you'd never expect, not just on a battlefield, but in a courtroom on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The letter, when it came, was plain and understated, the kind of document that carries enormous weight despite its unremarkable appearance. Judge Richard Harmon had been formally disciplined following the investigation, and given the combination of the health leave and the findings, he ultimately did not return to the bench. It wasn't framed as punishment for one careless remark about a medal. It was the result of a broader review that examined his conduct patterns over several years, and my case, it turned out, had simply been the thread that unraveled the rest. 3 other complaints, filed by different attorneys over different years, had been sitting quietly in a file somewhere, waiting for someone prepared enough to bring them into the light alongside this one. I felt no satisfaction reading it. Only a quiet, settled sense that something had been corrected that needed correcting. Melissa's lawsuit collapsed not long after that. The judge assigned to the reopened proceedings reviewed the original claims and found them baseless, built on nothing but frustration and a desire for a payout that was never legally hers to demand. The court ordered her to reimburse my legal costs, a consequence of what the ruling called a meritless filing pursued in bad faith. Daniel came to see me on a Sunday afternoon a few weeks after the ruling, sitting across from me at my kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he never drank. He apologized, not just for the lawsuit, but for years of not paying closer attention, for letting Melissa's resentment simmer without ever really asking where it came from or where it was heading. He told me he'd spent the drive over rehearsing what he wanted to say, and none of it had come out the way he'd planned, and I told him that was fine, that the rehearsed version rarely matters as much as people think it will. I told him what I'd learned a long time ago in the army, that you can't always stop someone from making a mistake, but you can decide how you respond when the dust settles. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I had my brother back. Not just a man caught in the middle of someone else's storm. Melissa left not long after. Not just the marriage, though that came too, eventually, quietly, without the drama I think she once imagined she was capable of creating. She left the family altogether, distancing herself from gatherings, from holidays, from the slow, patient work of repairing what she'd spent years chipping away at. I don't know exactly where she is now. Sometimes I wonder if she thinks about that morning in the courtroom, about the moment the ground shifted under everyone's feet, including her own. I hope wherever she is, she's found something better to build her life around than resentment. I mean that honestly. Bitterness is a heavy thing to carry, and I've never wished that weight on anyone, not even her. As for me, I didn't celebrate. There wasn't a party, no toast raised in victory. The day the results came through, I drove out to the old house instead, the one my parents left us, the one this entire ordeal had technically been about, though by the end it had become about something so much larger than square footage and property lines. I walked through the rooms slowly, running my hand along the same banister I used to slide down as a kid. I stood for a long moment under the oak tree my father planted the year I was born, now tall enough to shade half the backyard. The porch swing still creaked the same way it always had. Somewhere down the street a lawnmower was running, and for a moment the whole afternoon felt exactly the way it had when I was young enough to still believe the house would always belong to all of us in some uncomplicated way. I took my Navy Cross out of the small wooden box where I usually kept it, tucked away from daily view, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I've never needed to see it every day to remember what it meant. I held it in my palm for a while, thinking about the young woman I'd been on the day I earned it, and the older woman I'd become in the years since, and how strange it was that the same medal that once nearly cost me everything in a courtroom had ultimately been the thing that saved me. I don't need anyone else's permission to know what I did was real. I never did. Honor was never about being recognized. It's about not betraying it, even in the moments when no one else is watching, even when the person questioning you sits above you in a black robe with a gavel and thinks that gives them the final word. It doesn't. It never has. I stepped out onto the front porch that evening as the sun started to dip behind the trees, the American flag my father used to fly still hanging from its post by the steps, moving gently in the breeze. I thought about how some people believe power gives them the right to insult another person's dignity. But in a country built on the rule of law, power only survives when it walks hand in hand with responsibility. The day that Judge ordered me to remove my Navy Cross, he thought he was putting me on trial. In the end, it was his own career, and very nearly his own life, that ended up standing before the bench.